Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I'm Warren Christian, the great-great-grandson of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, and my brother and I are calling for the removal of his statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, because we believe the monument is an ongoing symbol of white supremacy and racism in the United States.
As President Trump faces growing outrage over his response to the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, we bring you an exclusive interview with the great-great-grandsons of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. And we speak with a North Dakota activist whose uncle marched in Charlottesville with the white supremacists. Plus, we'll talk to a former neo-Nazi who co-founded the group Life After Hate.
We decided at that point, 30 years ago, that we were not going to shave our heads. We were going to trade in our boots for suits. We were going to go enroll in college and recruit on campuses. We would get jobs in law enforcement, go into the military to get training and to be able to recruit there, and then even run for office. And here we are 30 years later with that dream or that nightmare realized.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today, a Democracy Now! Special, looking at the fallout from the recent deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where an anti-racist protester named Heather Heyer was killed when a car driven by a neo-Nazi plowed into a crowd of counter-protesters. The white supremacist charged with Heather's murder, 20-year-old James Alex Fields, Jr., was in Charlottesville for the Unite the Right rally, along with several thousand white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and Ku Klux Klan members, opposing the planned removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The night before, rally organizers held a march that was reminiscent of torch-lit parades in Nazi Germany, with hundreds of mostly young white men chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," and the 1930s Nazi slogan, "Blood and Soil." Later in the show, we'll speak to a former neo-Nazi and a North Dakota activist whose uncle marched with the white supremacists in Virginia. But first, we look at the growing movement to remove Confederate statues in the wake of Charlottesville. At least 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy can be found in public spaces across the country. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, most of them were built during the early decades of Jim Crow or in reaction to the civil rights movement, not right after the Civil War. But now a number of monuments are coming down. In Baltimore, the city, under orders from the mayor, removed all 4 of its Confederate statues. In Durham, North Carolina, protesters toppled a Confederate statue after a college student named Takia Thompson climbed up a ladder, looped a rope around the top of the Confederate soldiers' monument. She appeared on Democracy Now! Just before going to court.
I did this because the statue is a symbol of nationalism, and it's a symbol of white nationalism. And the type of white nationalism I'm talking about is the type of white nationalism that is sending me death threats on Facebook. I'm talking about the type of white nationalist that, you know, has killed a woman in a protest.
And the calls for the removal of the statues are even coming from the descendants of the leaders of the Confederacy. Today, an exclusive interview with 2 of the great-great-grandsons of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Jack and Warren Christian have just written an open letter to the mayor of Richmond, Virginia, calling for the removal of the Stonewall Jackson statue in Richmond. They write, quote, "Our sense of justice leads us to believe that removing the Stonewall statue and other monuments should be part of a larger project of actively mending the racial disparities that hundreds of years of white supremacy have wrought. We hope other descendants of Confederate generals will stand with us," they wrote. Well, Jack Christian joins us now from Western Massachusetts, where he teaches, and Warren Christian is in Raleigh, North Carolina. He works with international students at the University of North Carolina. I began by asking Jack Christian why he's speaking out.
I think that that wrote definitely is a product of something that we've been thinking about and feeling for a long while now, but was also very much catalyzed by what we saw in Charlottesville, and particularly in Durham, pulling down their Confederate monument. So that inspired Warren and I to kind of feel like this was the time to write this letter.
And Warren Christian, in Baltimore, under cover of night 2 nights ago, the mayor had 4 Confederate monuments pulled down. One of them was a monument of your great-great-grandfather, Stonewall Jackson. Your thoughts today and how you came together with Jack to call for the removal of not only monuments to your great-great-grandfather, but all other Confederate monuments.
Yes, well, this, like Jack said, this is something that we've felt for a long time. I think it's very clear if you look at the context in which the monuments were put up. They weren't celebrating kind of benign war heroes. They were very clearly meant to be things that would intimidate black people and further white supremacy in the U.S. Where I work at UNC, there's a prominent Confederate memorial, monument, statue right in the heart of campus. And since I've been at the University of North Carolina, I've wanted for that statue to be removed and felt like speaking out about it, and now finally kind of got the courage to do so. I think Jack and I, and along with our parents, it's kind of some mixed feelings, mixed emotions about being direct descendants of Stonewall Jackson. It's not something that I, widely share outside of a very close group of friends. So this is really kind of a coming out in a sort. And also I think the other thing is, in some ways, I don't feel like it should matter too much, how we feel about the statues, but I do understand that it is important to some folks how we feel about it. And for example, the statue at the University of North Carolina, when it was put up, the speaker, Julian Carr, who was a prominent local businessman, talked a lot about how the Confederate soldiers were working to save the Anglo-Saxon race. And then, really kind of disgustingly, at the end of his speech, he bragged about having his quotes, pleasant duty of horsewhipping a black woman in front of 100 federal soldiers and leaving her clothes in tatters. So I think the racist and white supremacist intent of these monuments is clear, and I think it's past time that they're all removed from the public squares of our country. You
work at the University of North Carolina?
Yeah, so I work at the University of North Carolina, and I'm somewhat disgusted walking past that statue on campus, and I can only imagine how it feels to students of color, and particularly black students who have to walk by that on their way to class. And I know that yes, sorry, Amy?
Have you told the president of the university or other students? You said you've kept pretty quiet about this until now, but about your desires to have that monument to your great-great-grandfather removed.
Not in a public forum, but I'd say this is it. I'd like that statue, of course, removed. I think the University of North Carolina, there's a lot of great people doing great work to try to recruit, retain, and support students of color and black students, and having this monument on campus just completely goes against that spirit.
Jack, can you tell us who Stonewall Jackson was?
Yeah, I'll do my best. It's funny, serendipitous almost, that earlier in the summer, I had started reading the biography from a few years ago called Rebel Yell by S.C. Gwynn that humanizes Stonewall in some new ways. He's famous. He got his nickname for standing in battle and not being pushed back by federal forces. If I'm not mistaken, in the first Bull Run and other Confederate generals observed him standing like that and said he's standing like a stone wall. So that's where his nickname comes from. His fame after that is for the Valley campaign that he waged in the western part of Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, where he, he, with a much smaller force, was able to hold off Union forces for a long time, which had the effect of greatly extending the Civil War in all likelihood. So that's who he was as a soldier. As a person, he was very complicated. He was an orphan who did well academically and graduated high in his class at VMI. He did, in his adult life, own slaves. He also was very religious, and as part of his religious calling, he taught Sunday school to enslaved peoples where he lived in Lexington, Virginia, which was, in my understanding of it, at least controversial, if not an illegal thing to do. So, this is sort of the person that we have kind of all our lives been thinking about, grappling with. That's my thumbnail sketch of him.
Warren and Jack, I was wondering if you could both read a part of this open letter that you have written.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'm going to read the first couple paragraphs, and Warren's going to read the last couple paragraphs. So we write, "Dear Mayor LeVar Stoney," that's the mayor of Richmond, "and members of the Monument Avenue Commission, we are native Richmonders and also the great-great-grandsons of Stonewall Jackson. As two of the closest living relatives to Stonewall, we are writing today to ask for the removal of his statue, as well as the removal of all Confederate statues from Monument Avenue. They are overt symbols of racism and white supremacy, and the time is long overdue for them to depart from public display. Overnight, 2 nights ago now, Baltimore has seen fit to take this action. Richmond should too. In making this request, we wish to express our respect and admiration for Mayor Stoney's leadership, while also strongly disagreeing with his claim that removal of symbols does nothing for telling the actual truth, nor changes the state and culture of racism in this country today. In our view, the removal of the Jackson statue and others will necessarily further difficult conversations about racial justice. It will begin to tell the truth of all of us coming to our senses. We go on in the letter to detail some of our rationale and family history, and then Warren's going to read the last few paragraphs.
Sure. Ongoing racial disparities in incarceration, educational attainment, police brutality, hiring practices, access to health care, and perhaps most starkly wealth, make it clear that these monuments do not stand somehow outside of history. Racism and white supremacy, which undoubtedly continue today, are neither natural nor inevitable. Rather, they were created in order to justify the unjustifiable, in particular, slavery. One thing that bonds our extended family, besides our common ancestor, is that many have worked, often as clergy and as educators, for justice in their communities. While we do not purport to speak for all of Stonewall's kin, our sense of justice leads us to believe that removing the Stonewall statue and other monuments should be part of a larger project of actively mending the racial disparities that hundreds of years of white supremacy have wrought. We hope other descendants of Confederate generals will stand with us. As cities all over the South are realizing now, we are not in need of added context. We are in need of a new context, one in which the statues have been taken down.
Those are the words of Jack and Warren Christian, the great-great-grandsons of the Confederate general Stonewall Jackson, calling for the removal of his monument in Richmond. Are you calling for the removal of his monument around the country, Jack?
We're calling for the removal of his monument in Richmond, firstly, but our argument is that all Confederate monuments and symbols should be removed from public display.
You take a different approach than Bertram Hayes Davis, the great-great-grandson of the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, who talks about contextualizing monuments. He's not against moving them, perhaps, into museums, but really emphasizes this issue of contextualizing. Warren, your response to that?
I think the context is that they were put up in support of this myth of the lost cause, that the Confederate soldiers were fighting kind of a noble fight, and that doesn't give the full weight to the fact that they were fighting to continue the institution of slavery. And
That's an interesting.
I mean, I think so. That's
an interesting point you raise, is that these Confederate monuments didn't go up right after the Civil War, but decades later, with the rise of the Klan and the introduction of Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, and that's why I think they shouldn't be. I don't think any American, and especially Black Americans, should be forced to pass these symbols of white supremacy on their ways to work, church, school. I don't think we can. I think it's part of our national healing. We're still very clearly, in my eyes, dealing with the effects of slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, of racist policies like redlining. And I think this, removing the monuments, ultimately, in my eyes, is just a small step that's necessary for racial healing in the country, along with many other much larger steps that are necessary.
Speaking about a proposed Gettysburg Memorial in 1869, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, quote, said, "I think it wiser not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the example of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered." So even the Confederate general, who has I don't know how many monuments of his likeness, of him, around the country, said there shouldn't be Confederate monuments, Jack. And I wanted to ask if you'd end by talking about whether you have your family's support, and, for example, your parents.
Yeah. We have not talked directly to our parents, although we sent the letter to them. But we very much believe that we have their support and know that this works in really in the spirit in which they brought us up to work and to fight for justice. I've been, this letter went up about midnight Eastern time last night, and I've been heartened to see. Others in our extended family have already reached out and said thank you, and that they appreciate what we've said. We certainly haven't heard from everyone, but the response from our family, and even I've gotten some response from other people who have Confederates in their ancestry that have said that they feel similarly. So we're very heartened by the response so far from our family.
As you watch what happened in Charlottesville, do you feel like there is a kind of new civil war in this country?
I certainly hope not. I was sickened by what we saw. I hadn't thought about it in quite so stark of terms, but I have thought about it that we definitely are at incredibly tense and stratified moment, and I think that we need to all take steps to have these conversations and to heal ourselves. So
I wanted to read.
That's my hope.
I wanted to read you a quote from Trump's chief strategist Steve Bannon, who reportedly is under fire in the White House. Who knows if that's true? But he did an interview with Bob Kuttner of the American Prospect, the liberal magazine. and said, quote, President Trump, by asking, where does this all end? Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, connects with the American people about their history, culture, and traditions. The race identity politics of the left wants to say it's all racist. Just give me more, tear down more statues, say the revolution is coming. I can't get enough of it, Bannon said. Jack, your response.
I wondered if you were going to ask me about that, and I listened to this on the news on my way into the TV station this morning. I think that ironically, part of Trump's statement has to do, choosing my words carefully, part of Trump's statement has to do with a larger conversation that is taking place and that needs to take place, where we recognize that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were also white supremacists and slave owners, and we think about that history. A writer on the online magazine The Root had a funny but apt take that I think sums it up. That said, the writer said, "Leave it to Trump to have a woke take on Thomas Jefferson," and I think there's some truth or some pithiness there. So go ahead.
Jack and Warren, you're both teachers?
Yes.
Yep.
What will you be telling your students today?
I have until September 6th to think about what I'll tell them.
Yes,
I'm in the fortunate
Warren?
position of working with international students, so it's really great to when they come to the U.S., they very quickly, if they haven't before they got here, realized that race is a huge issue in the U.S., but they still haven't fully formed their decisions. So what I try to do is always, in contextualizing what the situation surrounding race is in the U.S., is starting with slavery and segregation and making sure they understand that history to see how it's led us where we are today. And because they don't have so much kind of skin in the game, they're often very receptive to those messages in a way that working with American students and having discussions about race can be much more difficult.
Warren and Jack Christian, the great-great-grandsons of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. When we come back, we'll speak to a former neo-Nazi who co-founded the group Life After Hate.
And I wonder what it is they see. All the rallies will never set them free. Can you hear them call your name? Can you count the lives they will take? Do you have to see the body bags come off the plane? Just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit too late. Can you hear them call your name? Can you count the lives they will take? Do you have to see the body bags before you make a stand? Just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit too late.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Foreign Policy magazine recently revealed the existence of a recent FBI and Department of Homeland Security bulletin that concluded white supremacist groups are, quote, responsible for 49 homicides and 26 attacks from 2000 to 2016, more than any other domestic extremist movement, unquote. Despite the FBI and DHS findings, the Trump administration recently cut funds to groups dedicated to fighting right-wing violence. One of those groups, Life After Hate, which works to help white nationalists and neo-Nazis disengage from hate and violent extremism, was set to receive a grant under the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism program. The grant had been approved by the Obama administration, but when Trump Homeland Security Policy Advisor Catherine Gorka released the final list of grantees in June, Life After Hate had been eliminated. Gorka is the wife of former Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka. Sebastian Gorka has been linked to a Hungarian far-right Nazi-allied group. On the morning after the memorial in Charlottesville for Heather Heyer, I spoke with Christian Picciolini, who was once a leading neo-Nazi skinhead, gang member, and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s. He left the movement and co-founded Life After Hate. He's also author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead. I began by asking Christian Picciolini to talk about his response to what happened in Charlottesville.
I think I went to bed, Amy, on Sunday with a sick feeling in my stomach like most Americans did. But I have to tell you, what I saw last night with the community gathering together was what America means to me. I saw people of all different races, all different colors, creeds, religions, gathered together to pay homage to a woman who essentially gave her life to fight something that is very un-American. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope for America, because I know that we want to be able to live in a country where we can get along, where we have equal justice, where the systems of racism and the institutions are rebooted so that they're fair for everybody. And I think that this is a turning point for America, because I think we can stop sweeping it under the rug and thinking that we don't have a problem here. It's time to face it head on and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Christian, when did you become a white supremacist?
I was recruited at 14 years old in 1987.
Where did you live?
I was in Chicago, and that was the home and the birthplace of the American neo-Nazi skinhead movement. In fact, I was standing in an alley at 14 years old, and a man pulled his car up as I was smoking a joint, and he came over to me and he said, "Don't you know that that's what the communists and Jews want you to do to keep you docile?" 14, I was a marginalized kid. I'd been bullied. I didn't know what a communist or a Jew or even what the word docile meant. But this man brought me into a family. He gave me an identity, and he fed my sense of purpose. While it was all misdirected, being marginalized and disaffected and feeling abandoned, I was willing to trade in the feeling of power when I felt the most powerless for something that was evil and eventually swallowed whole.
And can you talk about the groups you were in and what you did?
I was a member of the Chicago area Skinheads, which was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group. Eventually, I became the leader of that group when the man who recruited me, who was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead, went to prison. I became the leader of this very infamous group, and we were involved in acts of violence. Our primary goal was marketing and recruitment. I started a band, which was a white power band that had violent lyrics that incited people to go out and commit hate crimes. And that was a recruiting tool. It was a social movement to get people together, young, angsty teenagers who were angry at the world, who felt like they had been pushed aside, and now were given somebody to blame for that.
What was it that started you moving away and questioning what you were doing?
You know, for the 8 years that I was involved, Amy, I had doubts the whole time. I came from an Italian immigrant family who came to the U.S. in the 60s, who were often the victims of prejudice. So I wasn't raised with these racist beliefs. It wasn't part of my family DNA or fabric. I questioned myself the whole time, but I squashed it because the power and the acceptance were more important to me, and I was scared to lose that. But essentially, over those 8 years, I started to meet people who I'd kept outside of my social circle, who I hated, African Americans and Jews and gay people. But the truth was that I had never had a meaningful interaction with them. But when I started to receive compassion from the people that I least deserved it from when I least deserved it. They could have attacked me, they could have threatened me, they could have broken my windows, but they didn't, and they knew who I was, and they took it upon themselves to show me empathy when I deserved it the least. And that helped me humanize them and dispel all the stereotypes that I had in my head, and suddenly I couldn't reconcile my hate anymore.
And what was the response of the other white supremacists in your group?
Well, they certainly weren't pleased, but luckily I was a pretty selfish leader and I never really groomed anybody to take over locally. So when I left, the group kind of imploded. However, I was a national and international figure at the time, and there were definitely threats of calling me a race traitor, you know, insinuations that I had started working with police, which were not true. And I still to this day receive death threats almost on a daily basis.
I wanted to turn to a white supremacist at the Charlottesville rally this weekend. This is white supremacist Christopher Cantwell, who was speaking with Vice reporter Elle Reeve about, well, among other issues, Ivanka Trump.
I'm here to spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump, who does not give his daughter to a Jew.
So Donald Trump, but like more racist.
A lot more racist than Donald Trump. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl, okay?
That is white supremacist Christopher Cantwell. I'm sure you saw clips of him, this Vice interview. Christian, your thoughts? In another part of this, they visit him where he's staying, and he has one gun after another throughout his waistband that he brings out, and finally brings out a knife, and he says he's well armed for more violence.
This gentleman is an insecure, has no self-confidence and is clearly broken. There's something broken. I'm a firm believer that ideology isn't what radicalizes people. I think it's the search for identity, community, and a sense of purpose. And if there's some sort of brokenness, a void underneath that in your life, and it could be trauma or addiction or mental health issues, anything that would hold you back or deviate your path from the intended one that you were on, you tend to look for acceptance in negative pathways. And it's interesting that we brought up this clip because I've actually reached out to this man after I saw the videos because he clearly needs help. And I want to offer him a compassionate ear to listen to what it is that is broken about him. Because what we do at Life After Hate is rather than argue ideologically with people, because we know that that just polarizes us further, we try to make the person more resilient, more competitive, more self-confident. And we do that by applying services like mental health therapy or job training or life coaching or even tattoo removal. And when that person feels more confident, they tend to blame the other less. But I would follow that up with challenging their doctrine, not by telling them they're wrong, but by introducing them to the people that they think that they hate. I may introduce a Holocaust denier to a Holocaust survivor, or an Islamophobe to spend a day with a Muslim family and have dinner. And it's those connections, those moments, because most people have never met the people that they hate, that helps them humanize these people and dispel the ideas of them being a monster or a parasite. And that has been the most effective tactic that we've used.
Christian Picciolini, who was once a leading neo-Nazi skinhead gang member and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s. He left the movement and co-founded the group Life After Hate. When we come back, we'll host a discussion between Christian and a Fargo, North Dakota activist whose uncle, who calls himself an open fascist, marched with the white supremacists in Charlottesville. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
What are the ideals that
is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our special broadcast, days after the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, a remarkable letter was published in a local newspaper in Fargo, North Dakota. The letter was written by Pierce Teft about his son, Peter Teft, who was photographed attending Saturday's deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. His father, Pierce Teft, wrote, "None of his beliefs were learned at home. We do not, never have, and never will accept his twisted worldview. Peter once joked, the thing about us fascists is, it's not that we don't believe in freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want. We'll just throw you in an oven." Well, his father went on, "Peter, you will have to shovel our bodies into the oven, too. Please, son, renounce the hate, accept and love all." Those are the words of Pierce Teft, the father of white supremacist Peter Teft, who marched in Charlottesville. Well, I recently spoke to another member of the family, Jacob Scott, Peter Teft's nephew. In addition to Jacob, I continued our conversation with Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate, a nonprofit helping people disengage from hate and violent extremism. Christian Picciolini was a leading neo-Nazi skinhead gang member and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s. I began by asking Jacob in Fargo about what's happening to his family.
Peter had, for a long time, been a bit of a bully and kind of unstable, and my cousin and I had long wanted there to be some kind of reaction to this from the family, some kind of repudiation. It was after Charlottesville, after he was involved in a demonstration that killed a person, that we were kind of finally able to get the rest of the family on board with us. And we had been kind of forthcoming to the community. There had been posters that had been put up around Fargo by some other people who had encountered him and who had dealt with his hate, kind of saying, with his picture on them, saying, this is Pete Teft, he's a Nazi, he's not welcome in this community. And when these posters started coming up, people started talking to me and my cousin, and we were like, yeah, he's a Nazi, you should disassociate with him if you know him. But, going to what the guy who founded Life After Hate said, I do think his ideology comes from something deeper than just, the facts or the values. He really, I feel like there's something broken about him as a person, and he's often he'll get very, very emotional very, very suddenly if you get him flustered, and he'll get violent. I mean, there was an incident where he attempted to assault my other cousin. So I definitely do agree with the idea that this comes from something more deep-seated.
How did his white nationalism happen? Did you see it as you were growing up? Are you about the same age, even though he's your uncle?
I'm a little younger than him. I'm the oldest of my generation. He's the youngest of his generation. So even though we're uncles, we're closer to age.
And
we're more like cousins.
What does it mean to say that his father has disowned him?
What was that?
What does it mean to say that his dad has disowned him? His family has disowned him?
Well, it means that he's not welcome at family gatherings anymore. It means that pretty much nobody in our family would welcome him into our homes. To answer your first question, our whole family, I mean, we're all progressives, we're all feminists, but around 2012, around the time of the Ron Paul presidential campaign, Peter started getting off into these sort of fringe internet spaces like 4chan and InfoWars and the like, and he started kind of swallowing up that whole mythos. And once he got inundated in that, he just kept moving further and further and further right, and this all happened kind of behind our backs. He became a men's rights activist, and then a couple years ago, he showed up to a family gathering and started ranting about the Jews, and I asked him if he identified as a white nationalist, and he said, yeah, I'm a fascist.
Talk about what it means now that your family has come out, the letter has been published in the paper, he has been outed as one of the white supremacists at the rally in Charlottesville.
Thousands of people came when Yes, You're Racist outed him, and were flooding his Facebook page with comments and various denunciations. There was a little bit of friendly fire, so to speak. There were a few people amidst the thousands who were coming after other members of our family, and you know, some people have been trying to say that these anti-fascists are just as bad as the fascists, and they're employing the same tactics, but ultimately, I mean, considering the thousands of people that went after my uncle, it was really just a few bad apples that were attempting to harass certain members of my family. And there were other people who were suggesting that we only disowned him and we only publicly disowned him to save ourselves, so to speak, to absolve ourselves of guilt. But again, like, my cousin and I had been pushing for this for some time. We do not believe that a Nazi should be welcome in our family, and we long wanted him to be excluded from family events. We don't think that accepting a Nazi into the family, allowing a Nazi to go to our family events is a morally right thing to do. It condones Nazism. It says that it's okay for him to be a Nazi and that he'll still be welcomed into the family. And so we were very glad that we were finally able to get the rest of the family on board with this.
So I was wondering if Christian Picciolini could respond to Jacob. Christian Picciolini, the former neo-Nazi and co-founder of this group, Life After Hate. If you could talk about what you've just heard and how Jacob's family has now come out to also out his uncle, the white nationalist Peter Tefft, who was part of the rally in Charlottesville. What do you think can be done in this case? I mean, you've been through this a lot now. People who, like yourself, were white supremacist and then started to change.
You know, I agree with Jacob that we have to hold people accountable for what they say and what they do. However, I don't agree with the tactic of public shaming or calling somebody out with the intention of pushing them further away. And I know that wasn't the intention. The intention was to try and make a statement so that Peter knew that his family cared about him and would welcome him back if he renounced his views. But what happens and why people join these types of movements is because they already feel ostracized, because they already feel marginalized and disenfranchised. And pushing him farther away and not giving him the support of a family structure, I fear will actually push him further into this movement, because he went searching for something. He went searching for a community or a family and an identity. And if the family, the real family he has, is pushing that away even further, the chances of him coming back because he feels remorse about what his family said are slim to none, in my opinion.
Jacob, if you could talk about what it would mean to welcome Peter back and any efforts you've made as he increasingly turned to white supremacy to reach out to him before this final disavowal.
Well, I understand what Mr. Picciolini is saying. In this, and I would agree with that in the general case, if a family out there has somebody who's starting to fall into the white supremacist kind of mind trap. But in Peter's individual case, I have to think that he's simply too far gone. He's, you know, I before the break, I was talking about how he's as a person, he's a bit unstable and a bit unhinged. You know, part of the reason why my cousin and I wanted to have him kind of formally disowned from the family, formally barred from family events, is because, frankly, we do fear him. And he, like I said, he gets very, very emotional very, very suddenly if he's even slightly flustered. And he's very muscular. He's very strong. And a lot of family members just don't feel safe around him. So while there is the consideration of, you know, how best can we deal with him in such a way that he'll feel that he can still come back to us, there's also the consideration of, you know, in the meantime, could he potentially hurt us? Would it be more healthy for us to make sure that he's not in our presence, at least until he on his own can find his way back?
Christian, any words of wisdom here? I mean, not only did you move away from white supremacy, the neo-Nazi movement, but I am in your group, if you could tell us stories, Life After Hate, of other people, and what are the most effective approaches through specific anecdotes and stories.
Sure. Well, our approach is to work with people in a compassionate and empathetic way, and to listen to what they have to say instead of arguing with them ideologically or pushing them further away. And what I listen for are these things that I call potholes. What existed in their path that deviated it. And then my job becomes to fill those potholes, whether it's job training or life coaching or tattoo removal or mental health therapy. And what happens inevitably is when people are more equipped, understand what they're dealing with internally, they don't necessarily need to blame somebody else for what they feel is being taken away from them, because now they're more resilient and they're more able to compete and they're more self-confident. However, I do challenge their ideology as well, but not by debating. What I do is I introduce them to people that they think that they hate. And I've introduced Holocaust deniers to Holocaust survivors, Islamophobes to imams and Muslim families to have family dinner. And it's those types of connections, those opportunities to humanize that really bring people back, because people join these groups because they're out searching for something that they're not getting in their real life.
I wanted to go to your uncle, Peter Teft, who recently spoke to the local station WDAY-TV in Fargo, North Dakota, where you too, Jacob, live. Peter defended the term fascist and said he doesn't blame his family for speaking against him publicly.
Fascism is just loving your family and doing what's best for your nation. I don't hold anything against them for what they had to say about me, because it's the safest thing to do in this political climate. Nazi is a racial slur towards white people.
Jacob, as you listen to him, your thoughts?
I mean, he says things like that. Fascism is about loving your family, and Nazi is a racial slur against white people. I mean, it's like he's so far gone down the rabbit hole that you can't even reach him to bring him back. Obviously, I hope that's not true, but ultimately, that's the case that we find ourselves in. You know, I consider myself pretty far left. I consider myself a democratic socialist, and he's talked to me about how he and I and my people and his people should team up, because we're both fighting against the same establishment, the same globalists. And you know, I say to him, you know, you believe in racial separation. I believe in racial reparation. There's no similarity between us. And he and lots of Nazis think that they're fighting against the establishment, but racism is the establishment, you know? I mean, capitalism is built on racism from the ground up. And so when you have this worldview that kind of looks at everything upside down and backwards, I don't know how to reach him and how to prevent him from doing the things that he says he's going to do.
Christian Picciolini, when you hear Peter speak, Jacob's uncle, what are your thoughts?
Well, from what I heard from the clip from Peter and what I heard from Jacob is that what Peter is saying is straight out of the manual. He's repeating all the things that he's been taught. I want to just give the viewers a little bit of hope. And when Jacob says, he's too far gone, I don't believe that anybody is ever too far gone. I've worked with, grand dragons of the KKK who've been in for 40 years and recognized the error of their ways, and suddenly now realize, that's not what they want to do anymore, and that they've wasted, their lives. I myself have a very checkered past. When I was involved in the movement, I was invited to Libya by Muammar Gaddafi to receive money to start a revolution against the Jews. I committed acts of violence that nearly killed many people. I stockpiled weapons to prepare for what I believed was an inevitable race war. So, to that I would say, and I've worked with people in prison who've murdered people of color because of their racism, and while they were in prison, they found a way to disengage from that, which is probably the hardest environment to do that. So, just to give some hope, I've worked with some very tough people who, most people would never think would change. And it's really that compassion that you show them, because that's what's been lacking both within themselves and from the people around them as they get frustrated with, their loved ones' beliefs. So what I would say to Jacob is, don't give up. If you care, and it's apparent that the family cares about, Peter, otherwise they wouldn't have said the things that they did, but don't give up.
Jacob, did Peter text you after the Klan march on Friday night, the torch march, where hundreds of white supremacists marched through the University of Virginia campus, leading to one of the counter-protesters having a stroke as he was hit by these tiki torches in front of the Thomas Jefferson statue at the University of Virginia. But did he text you after the rallies on Friday and the attack on Saturday?
Yes, he actually texted me after I was on CNN yesterday. He was texting me, convinced that I was secretly on his side and that I was somehow helping him by giving publicity to this rally that he wanted to hold. I'm hoping that he's delusional about this and that he doesn't actually have the clout to be able to organize a rally, which may very well be the case. But if he holds his rally, he says he wants to hold it in October. And if that's the case, then we will hold our counter rally, and we hope that people would come to Fargo and help us, because we have a thriving progressive community here in Fargo, and I'm sure that there will be lots of people here who want to counter protest. But if Peter does have a large national profile, and it's seeming like he might be developing one because of this whole incident, he might be able to bring in, who knows how many Nazis, and they might be able to outnumber us the way we saw in some of the pictures from Charlottesville, where there were, just a small ring of counter-protesters and then just a sea of tiki torches around them. That's not a situation that I want to see here in Fargo. So if he does end up doing something, I would hope that we could get some people from outside of town to come and help us.
The leader of the Vanguard America neo-Nazi hate group that rallied in Charlottesville, Dylan Ulysses Hopper, was a Marine Corps recruiter. Now, this is very interesting. It's believed that this information led the Marine Commandant, the head of the Marines, to issue a statement. General Robert Neller, Marine Corps Commandant, tweeted, "No place for racial hatred or extremism in USMC," the U.S. Marine Corps. "Our core values of honor, courage, and commitment frame the way Marines live and act." And it wasn't only the Marine Commandant who tweeted, but it seems that almost every general of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have now made statements, and it may well be in part because of President Trump's unhinged, fiery, bellicose news conference that took place on Tuesday. I wanted to play for you part of what President Trump said on Tuesday about the deadly Charlottesville white supremacist rally.
Said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as neo, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Very fine people. Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate, the nonprofit that helps people get away from right-wing extremism, leave groups like the neo-Nazis, the Klan. What are your thoughts, the role that President Trump is playing? There are groups like the Anne Frank Center here in New York that say Twitter should close his account because he is inciting hatred and violence.
Well, I believe that Donald Trump is the internet's biggest troll. I think his account should be shut down because, in the process of his rants and his daily tweets, maligning everybody from disabled people to women to people of color and supporting, organizations like the alt-right and retweeting white nationalists, this is not appropriate action for somebody who holds the largest and most powerful office justice in the world. The FBI published a report recently that showed that there is a massive amount of recruiting happening within the military and within law enforcement. And in fact, it was a concerted strategy of ours 30 years ago when I was involved in the movement, when we recognized that the shaved heads and the swastika flags and the Klan hoods were turning away the average American white racist that we could recruit, but they were too afraid to join because, of how edgy we were. So we decided at that point, 30 years ago, that we were not going to shave our heads. We were going to trade in our boots for suits. We were going to go enroll in college and recruit on campuses. We would get jobs in law enforcement, go into the military to get training and to be able to recruit there, and then even run for office. And here we are 30 years later with that dream or that nightmare realized. Now, they're wearing polos and khakis, and they blend in. They look like our doctors, our mechanics, our teachers, our nurses, and it's hard to distinguish them aside from the words that they say and the actions that they take, which oftentimes in public, when they're alone, they won't do. So I think that the movement now is much, much bigger than it is because it has become normalized. It's infected the average American who normally, would only say things like that behind closed doors or to people that they trusted, now feel very emboldened because of the words and the actions and the policies of the president, that they feel they have a commander-in-chief who gets them, who understands their ideology and is willing to stand up for them and fight for them. And at that press conference, in fact, that's what he did by equating both sides and saying that there were good people on both sides and not specifically calling out the alt-right. I should mention this. He denounced the KKK, he denounced neo-Nazis and white nationalists, but what he specifically left out was the alt-right. And then he later went on to defend them, saying, well, they had a permit and the other folks didn't. As far as I'm
talked about the alt-left, the other folks.
And talked about the alt. There is no alt-left. There are Americans and then there are Nazis. And let me just say, the people that didn't have a permit there, the people who were there to counter-protest the Nazis, well, the U.S. Constitution gave them a permit to do what they did, so they didn't need one. And as far as I'm concerned, that's one of our most important American values, is the ability to protest what we see as damaging to our core American values, which still, frankly, need a lot of work.
I want to turn to a new Trump tweet. He just wrote, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." The words of the President of the United States, Christian Picciolini.
Yeah, let me just jump in. Let's take the statues down however we need to take them down. Let's put them in Confederate cemeteries so people who do genuinely believe in the heritage, even though I disagree with that, can still pay homage to their idols and to their family members who lost their lives in the Civil War. However, I think we need to replace those statues with civil rights heroes, true Americans who did give their lives to fight for justice and the American dream, and especially the Robert E. Lee statue that is in Charlottesville. I would propose that a statue goes up in its place to honor the 3 people who died that day, because those are true Americans. These are people that we need to look up to. These are the values that we hold dear as Americans, not politicians or military generals who promote war, who promote slavery, who own slaves. That's not what America's about anymore. We're moving forward, and we need to move forward with the values that we hold dear and that we want our children to be able to benefit from. So let's take them down and let's replace them with something that represents who we are and who we want to be.
That's Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate, a nonprofit helping people disengage from hate and violent extremism. He was a leading neo-Nazi skinhead gang member and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s. He's the author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead. We are also speaking with Jacob Scott, the nephew of Fargo, North Dakota native Peter Teft, the white supremacist who was part of the recent hate rally in Charlottesville. That does it for our show. If you'd like to sign up for our daily headlines, you can text the word Democracy Now!, one word, no space, to 66866. That's Democracy Now! To 66866. And go to our website for video and audio podcasts, all transcripts of our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Jarina Nadura, Amel Ahmed, and Nat Needham. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grand, David Prude, Ariel Boone. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.